So, Joe, I'm going to kick off with one of the questions that was sent, and I wanted to throw it at you to start with. You look at this interface of technology and aging in very broad ways, and an amazing view of this landscape. And I'm sure whatever we come up with as an answer today is not going to be the right answer, but you've got to start somewhere. So what of all of this that you're looking at excites you the most in terms of actually making it to market and making a difference at scale in people's lives?
You know, it's taken too many decades, but I'm getting excited now because the technology that will help people age well and stay independent and in their homes and connected is now becoming mainstream. For decades, we were developing little devices for mom or dad to use a computer or to remind them to take their meds, and those are all well and good. But I'll tell you what's exciting now. If I walk into CVS or if I walk into Boots in London or I walk into Best Buy, entire aisles now are developing. And, you know, consumers, when they start to see it mainstream, they will see it as a lifestyle. You want to get things into people's homes in their 40s and 50s, because if you tell them they need it when they're 70 and 80, less likely to accept it. But if it's cool and convenient in my midlife, it'll be there for me to provide care in my older life.
Thank you. It's interesting that a significant, if not majority of the examples you gave are coming to the marketplace consumer-driven.
Yes.
And the consumer's driving them rather than the traditional professions or, you know, the regulatory environment in our traditional structured way. So it's going to raise some interesting questions on at some point when our traditional professional mediated fields and our consumer fields converge as it's happening, how our regulator and our government and all of these other interfaces are going to drive either new regulatory science or completely new and drive that to new regulations themselves? Or are they going to become a barrier to the rate of deployment? So we could take a number of questions, but I thought given this convergence that's coming, one of our participants wanted to pick it up from here. And how do we think, maybe Paul, given your background, how do we prepare for this so this actually keeps moving to the market?
Let me comment on a few things, as long as you called on me. One, and I was glad that Joe touched on the access piece, the equity and access piece. I mean, I think we have to have, if we're going to be serious about scale and spread, a real conversation about broadband as a utility. You know, the U.S. may not lead, and you know, it's important for all of us who are on the commission to remember that this is an international exercise, and oftentimes I think we look elsewhere for leadership on this front. But it's not just broadband. I think we have to have a conversation about digital health tools being covered by Medicare in the United States, National Health Service in the UK, and certainly by Advantage plans. So thinking about these tools not just as innovative, interesting, exciting, fun, but as a core part of prevention, wellness, and care that deserve and really mandate, I think, reimbursement. Another thing, we spent a lot of time in my world talking about financial literacy and health literacy. I think we have to have increasing conversation and focus on digital literacy, again, as a matter of democratizing the opportunities. And I would just say on the innovation front, Joe mentioned that this is going to take innovation and involvement in both the public sector and the private sector. I think we've seen in some regional initiatives a recognition that unless we embed expertise about aging and older people in agencies having nothing to do with aging and older people, in other words, not at the NIH, not at the CDC, not at NAM, Victor, but at agencies that may not have people that understand the realities of shifting demography. We won't have their attention and focus on changing policies and practices and in funding projects that deal with the realities of population aging. So I would just say that I think that that's important. We need to spark capital investment and recognize the economic power. And I would also just say that it's really important that older adults be involved in the process. Joe, you and I were both at the 2015 White House Conference on Aging, and you remember the great Barbara Beskind. I'm sure you remember, who was at IDEO. She was, I think, 91 or 92 when she spoke at the Obama White House. And she said very famously, you can't just design for us, you have to design with us. And so it's not just about creating products for 40-year-olds that they'll retain when they're 60, 70, 80, and 90. It's about bringing those 60, 70, 80, and 90-year-olds into the process at the outset and ensuring that products make sense for them and that they're usable and effective.
Thank you. I think Beth raised a question, and maybe I could add a question for you as well on this, Beth, given the chat discussion that's going on. Reimbursement, yes, but are there learnings from nationalized health systems where you could overcome reimbursement challenges? Appreciate your comments on how to think about this. Again, in terms of deployment of technologies, given Joe's comment, we have the technology, we haven't figured out how to get them out there. And there are lots of barriers to this. But over to you.
Thank you so much. And I want to start by agreeing and disagreeing with Joe to get the discussion going. So, as we've been working in this area for 2 decades or more at Georgia Tech and others, we certainly saw the barrier to getting the technologies in the home. And we've watched different market attempts and failures. And of course, now we live in an era of great consumer demand. But what we don't live in is an era of creating technologies that are usable for the older adults that we're discussing. Even if the interface happens to be well designed for the moment, and most of them are not, they quickly change out in the name of featureitis and creating kind of more appeal in the marketplace. And I'm working with a robust group of older adults, the joint program between Georgia Tech and Emory for older adults with mild cognitive impairment. And just simply the changes that come in and day out amongst these technologies will wipe out, a good solid, week of training and engagement, and just leads to so much frustration. So we need to go past the achievement of consumer pull for these smart home technologies, but nevertheless wrestle the design and engagement with these technologies so that they, as Sheila was saying in the chat, that they can be used by older adults kind of day in and day out across years, across decades, as this equation that we're looking at. And this points to your second question of what is the role of nationalized and larger healthcare systems? Because as an individual, it's difficult to argue to say, please quit changing out my Fitbit, my Echo, my Alexa, pick any device of your choice. But if it becomes part of the equation for care for aging within these healthcare systems, then hopefully we can now create a new market push that would create stable designs and usable designs that not only take care of the needs of older adults, but their larger care networks. And that's the last point I want to make, is that I think too often this is framed of, if older adults can just use, or if older adults can adopt. It needs to be a larger question, not only around care networks and family caregivers, as Joe and others have discussed, but communities as a whole. So I realize too often now how interactions in restaurants and banking, not to mention Ubers and Lyfts, and all of those great services that are out there, how unfriendly they are to older adults, especially with any indication of cognitive impairment. So this needs to be a public health discussion just as much as a medical discussion, and that's going to require different approaches towards technology and the experiences of aging across our communities. So thank you for letting me chime in.
Thank you. Actually, you preempted my next question, which I was going to target at Linda or anybody else who wants to jump in, which is almost not a rhetorical question, but is it too early to have public health evidence that this is all making a difference, or is it just a matter of time before we take everything, all the exciting stuff that Joe just outlined, to say that this is making a difference in the community? And Hiroki, you mentioned institution, either at a population level, community level, or institution level. Are we there yet, or what will it take to get that evidence?
Let me start. This is Hiro Nakatani. I think, Joe, thank you very much. Your fascinating and enjoyable presentation. I like it. And you have concentrated on, I think, person-centered. But I think one big area of technology, in my view, is institutions. For example, Japanese nursing care institutions, very heavy headache is handling urine and the stools during the night. So we are putting some sensor under the bed, and the body movement can estimate when that person is really going to have a pee. In that case, nurse is coming, and well, would you go for toilet? That prevent, I think, urinations a mess.
Yeah.
That is the implication for labor. I think in change linen in the middle of the night, we need 2 hands. But if we can sense it in advance, so one person is looking after one ward or one unit. So that is a productive part is important. And when we are facing population aging and also population decline, keeping nursing force is very important. So productive enhancement aspect of utilization of new technology is also very important. This is number one. Second is you are concentrating in personal basis, but in a little bit society basis, we are growing evidence that if we design city well, and that will prevent fall, that is consequence we can prevent fracture. That prevent bed-ridden situation. So all I think this handling of big data by mass information handling will be very fascinating area. But that is for us, the largest problem is our privacy prevention law doesn't allow to combine our information together. So that is, I mean, compartmentalize of information makes our life very difficult. Thank you.
I was typing my answer to you in the chat, but one of the things that you're exactly right. Senior housing in particular, or nursing care, the cost of labor, the inability to find enough labor. Technology is going to have to be, shall we say, the new force multiplier for an aging society. And also the idea of proactive technology. I don't want a device that detects that I fell on the floor. I want a device that says my gait has changed and I'm about to fall on the floor.
Linda.
So thank you, everybody. What an exciting discussion, and Joe, great presentation. Mahmoud, I'm just trying to think what my own response would be to the question you posed about is it time? Are we ready for thinking about public health's role? And I would say absolutely. I say that as a geriatrician who leads a school of public health, but thinking, for example, about the U.S. public health system, which has multiple roles, including being the lead community health strategist. And taking, Joe, maybe your example of loneliness. You know, what are the major connectors we have learned in this pandemic we need? Well, absolutely, connectivity, electronic connectivity via broadband as a public utility is as important as public transport. And these are functions that, as well as other things, that connect us. So I think that there are absolutely, we need to elevate the thinking about what we need to deliver at a population level to create the conditions that make, to use Joe's terms, function and vitality the easy option.
Thank you. Sarah, you wanted to jump in on this?
Yes, I'd like to make a couple of points. One, apropos to Linda's comment, I think I agree totally, and I think public health involvement is essential if we're going to talk about equitable distribution of technology. And I think that's, and Paul mentioned that earlier as well, when we're thinking about all these devices and all these new developments. I mean, we really have to think hard about how do we reach all segments of the population, especially those who are vulnerable. And I think that that has been a huge challenge. And when I'm talking about vulnerability, I think in equity, I think we need to define it broadly. It's people who of varying social and economic status, certainly digital literacy and health literacy. But I think that this issue has to be, it's not just a research issue about how we do it, it's also a public policy issue and a public health issue. The other thing, and this is picking up on what Beth said, when we're thinking about user groups and including them in the design, I mean, our group CREATE and that of Beth and many of my other colleagues have been, and Joe, and very nice talk, Joe, and happy birthday, have been thinking about a user-centered design approach and pushing this design approach for a very long time. And we all have evidence that it helps make technology applications more useful and more successful. But we still haven't broken the barrier, I think, with a lot of the design community in terms of incorporation of this approach in the design of products, new technologies, and devices. And I think we really have to think about strategies. Maybe it's, interactions more between people who have this philosophy in the design community, but we have to think about strategies to push that forward. And the third thing I just want to have some people think about is we can talk a lot about technology and the potential benefits of technology, but I also think we have to give some thought about potential negative implications. What are some disruptions that occur if we push technology too far in terms of social relationships, in terms of diminished ability? So I think there's a balance we need to look at in terms of the positive aspects of technology, but also some of the disruptions that technology might bring.
Thank you. Don?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I'm not in your community of aging researchers, but I do work on technology that is, I say, future technology, and that crosses engineering, biology, physical sciences. And what we've been talking about now is largely IT-based and near-term. And I think one of the goals of this meeting, from my understanding, is thinking about where the future lies. And I'd love to also to get this community's feedback, thinking about how new types of technologies might be entered into this environment, given all the challenges that you laid out that we see already for IT. And the first thing, and also there were themes that in the first session, I don't know if everyone attended, that I think need to be brought up. And the first thing I would say is that the best way I can see of getting technology to the aging is to not call it technology for the aging, but call it wellness technology. That's the first thing. The second thing is, developing ways to have massive distribution of low-cost diagnostics, let's call it, but it's really, biomarker readouts that everyone could have that you follow individually. And this comes back to clinical trials that would be so hard to do on the elderly. They would take so long, so expensive. But really, not all elderly are the same, and we know that. Everyone ages differently. And the possibilities of doing clinical trials on the individual is real. I think it's real in a time when you can get real-time data on that individual. But if you could start combining biological readouts and biomarkers and wearables that measure, functionality, that's the functionality that really old people care about, which is falling, walking, being able to get where you want and do things for yourself. And these are coming, and so it's interesting. I mean, there are diagnostics that you could do in 30 minutes, 1,000 different readouts that are going to be cheap and disposable. There are glucometer type devices that you could do on a drop of blood and have multiple biomarkers that you can do at home or in a CVS. And so, for you guys, I think to think like, if you're going to, right now, the standard would be to overlay it and let the marketplace do it. But you've already learned, I'm hearing about all the challenges that you can see because they're not taking into account the patient, let's not call them a patient, let's call them the people. And so I work on technology called organs on chips. And there was a question to me earlier and I wasn't there, which are literally little micro devices lined by human cells from people. And, we are doing we're doing studies on male versus female, funded by the FDA because of the limits of clinical trials, not showing the right representation. You can do young and old. You can do people with different diseases. They're pretty amazing in terms of recapitulating phenotypes. And the idea of developing, let's say not new drugs, but let's say choose the right combination of drugs for this patient while measuring their heart rate, gait control over a month at home in their environment is interesting. It raises possibilities of treating the individual as their own clinical trial group for them. And it can be done cheaply, quickly, with 100% likelihood that it's right for them. And I think the medical system's not set up this way. The best we can do is maybe think about failing in a big trial and then finding a small genetic subgroup that are similar and narrowing it down. It's backwards. So there was discussion about circadian rhythms in earlier session and aging. It's an area we're working on and came at, funded by DARPA, that was also mentioned, to develop drugs to induce a state of suspended animation, like true science fiction, mimicking hibernation. And we're actually coming up with compounds that can slow metabolism, even in we've even working with the military on whole limb transplants. But the idea of having people slow metabolism part of the day, people do it with meditation, but could you extend functionality by slowing metabolism? Could you?
Don, if I might, I've got several people wanting to jump in. Sure. So I could ask you to wrap up.
Yeah, no, of course.
Yeah, I want to go back to the last session's biology. Really would like to focus though.
Well, these are all the point is that these are found with machine learning based approaches using informatics and experimental systems. But I'll stop. I was asked about commenting from earlier, but I do think the idea of personalizing this with biological technologies and how you integrate it into everything that you guys are doing is a big challenge for the future.
Thank you. I would like to come back to this broader question of how these technologies, we've talked a lot about how technologies enhance and might support and help functionality as devices. But the notion of how technologies might inform us to do better biology and actually even further change biology has really not been touched on. So would love to come back to that. But let me make sure everybody gets a chance to jump in, because I think Poppy was next.
Thanks, Mood. And it actually follows on from Don's comments. I think there are a lot of commonalities in the things you just said. So for anyone, I'm not an aging researcher. I am a neuroscientist who works in the technology space. I do happen to be on the board of the consumer technology industry and association. And there's a lot of effort to think about the opportunities that are in front of us right now. But I think a few things that are really, to me, there's a big transition and pivot point right now that's happening in technology that this community should be taking advantage of. And it's the way, it's a shift from how we think about accessibility, how we think about one size fits all solutions, things that weren't scalable even 10 years ago, to personalize for every individual, suddenly are able to be personalized at very efficient, in very efficient ways. The concept of personal technology and how technology is personalized to an individual is something that most every company right now has major efforts anchored towards. Even in the entertainment space right now, I can tell you that, an 8-year-old, a 40-year-old, and an 80-year-old can't enjoy content together. They can't watch a movie together and have an experience. They can't be on the same Zoom call and have common settings. We don't have to think that way because the scalability of the cost has completely changed. And it's because of machine learning, cloud computing, and 5G are going to transform that right now. We have the ecosystems in place to support this kind of personalization. You've got technologies where we can understand the biometrics, even like in the ear, we can capture heart rate, pulse ox, ways of understanding cognitive effort, ways of destigmatizing, using that information to enable dialogue enhancement. We can personalize how someone hears, how someone sees. We can think about technology instead of we built a device that works for a 40-year-old, we built a device, and these are all the parameters and variables that are going to be constantly taking in the data around us from our room or from our bodies, hopefully not tethered with lots of devices, because that's now moved into our environments with the amalgamation of sensors and biometrics we can pick up. But we can instead think about how should this technology be supporting that individual? In Hollywood, we often talk about creative intent. And that means, how do you translate the storyline of the creator in a way that, on the other end, the person's having that experience? I like us talking about always the technology intent and how is that realized, and what are the metrics that we use to assure that the individual is actually interacting with that technology as intended and then supporting them from a cognitive and from a physical perspective. And rebranding accessibility to personalization starts putting that in a very different space in a lot of different companies when we think about it. And on its own, it starts supporting gender differentiation, skin color differentiation, differentiation in aging, differentiation in mobility and dexterity, differentiation in sensory capabilities. And suddenly you are getting a lot of gain in ways that then can fan out and be supported with a particular demographic. So thanks.
Thank you. An important perspective of positioning, branding, the terminologies we use as we think of this. So, Ziad.
Thank you. I'm also not I'm aging and I'm a researcher, but I'm not an aging researcher. I did have a point that I think all of my work is applying machine learning to medical data. And that makes me very attuned to one point about measurement. And measurement is, I think, a really fundamental problem in this area of aging, because we actually only have one measure of aging, and that's time since birth. But as we all know, that's not a particularly good measure of aging. It doesn't represent the full range of biological aging, and it certainly doesn't let us track the effect of interventions, whether they're preventative or therapeutic. And so I want to put this forward as like a big scientific challenge and a roadblock and a barrier that's holding a lot of this field back. Because unless we can measure a disease, it's going to be very hard to study it. You wouldn't think of fighting infectious disease without culture and antigen testing. You wouldn't think about treating fractures or other injuries without X-rays and tomography. And I think we have this huge problem with aging, which is that we don't know how to measure it very well. rather than just leaving that with a problem statement, I want to also say that I think there's a lot of promise in new ways of analyzing the very complex high-dimensional data that we get from electronic health records in the medical system, but also increasingly from wearable devices. So I think that those kinds of measurement technologies, even though they're kind of raw measures that just come off of the routine aspects of the healthcare system, or wearing your watch, or wearing a patch, those things, when combined with algorithms, actually have the potential to really improve the way we measure aging, the way we create targets for research, for clinical trials, for other kinds of things. And so I think that's a very exciting area. It does hinge critically on having those data available. And so a lot of my work is actually not just for my own research, but building data sets that are these imaging data sets linked to things like age and disease onset and things like that, that other researchers can use, and making those open platforms for data. So I think that that's a really important issue that hasn't gotten enough attention, that I think a lot of the people in this room might be able to have creative solutions to.
Thank you. I think Katie was next.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you
Yes.
so much. First, I'd like to thank Joe for giving us such a fantastic talk, and a happy birthday. And I appreciate the opportunity. Really, this is remarkable. So just quickly, I think a lot of people mentioned that we are really in a different era now, talking about the sensors, wearables, and devices, and Internet of Things, digital itself, digital health. All of this, I think, was common underneath them is the big data issue. And with that, I think we are also facing with a very powerful computational models, algorithms, as that said. There are machine learning, AI, data science technologies that, give us things we couldn't even imagine before. And Joe also mentioned that, we may not really care about when someone really falls, the detection, but we want to know things in advance. So all these data and the technologies can give us some predictive power, predictive analytics, and it gives us maybe some simulation for us to prevent crises from happening. So that's from a very positive perspective. I think we are in a new area, but there are so many things we haven't experienced before. It might very well be doing, making some groundbreaking advantages. But there are also some negative things about those. Because they are so new, we're not sure about the volume, the variety of the data, the velocity, and the veracity. So how do we really come up with the right reminder or alert? That's still something we have to deal with down the road. I really like how Joe did the F word, the P word. So I like say, there are V word as well. So when there's a new era of technology, we have to deal with the V's that come with the big data.
Thank you, Katie. I think since hearing aids and getting our EKG out of our ear has been raised, I have to go to Judy next.
Thank you all for inviting me to this fantastic discussion, and thank you, Joe, and happy birthday for a wonderful talk. And actually, my comment was not going to be related to hearing. I'm just very glad that everyone's brought it up, and it's nice to have that as part of the discussion whenever we're talking about older adults. But my comment was actually going to be about ethical issues, which I think we really have to be part of the discussion. There are issues related to privacy and security and trust, especially related to behavioral, emotional, and other kinds of data. Some data may be sensitive or carry stigma. I think older adults need to feel like they have more control over their data. There's a lot of data moving around, location data, who other people have access to the data. And I think that's something that really needs to be addressed as part of this issue. It's I think we just have to get control over who has access. And if older adults are going to feel comfortable doing this, they have to know that their data are protected. the other issue I wanted to bring up was we talked a lot about biases and access and rural people in rural areas. And I heard, and from what I've read, this is an international mission, an international group. And, you know, we're thinking about the way things are in the United States. And I think we really have to consider how things are in low and middle income countries. And we can't think about the way things are just among us privileged few. So I just wanted to remind everybody about that. And there is an unusual issue going on with biases because the older adults who have the available resources, they're most likely to be the people who are socially engaged through family and friends. And therefore, they have more access to technology. They have people to instruct them in how to use the technology. So it's the very people who are isolated are the ones that are going to be most difficult to reach, that might benefit most from the technology. The other comment, this will be my last, is that social isolation and loneliness was brought up several times. Very, very important. We need to think about ways of fostering social connections. We saw a picture of robots and so on. But we also have to consider that technology may not be an effective replacement for in-person social contact. I think we all learned a little bit about that this year, that these Zoom meetings which we would consider technology, are very helpful. I mean, look what we brought together tonight. Well, for me, it's tonight. But we do miss some in-person social contact. So I think we do have to keep that on the table as well. So I will stop here. Thank you all.
Thank you, Judy. When I wrap up, I think one of the important discussions is around equity, but also individual rights around all of this data that we're going to be generating, whether you're elderly, young, or any other population, in particular vulnerable population. So glad you brought that up. I think Jada was next.
Yeah, thank you. And it's Jutta Trebranus. And one of the things, I actually saw it come up now in the chat. One of the things that I think is quite important is multi-generational connections, sustaining the connections to the community and to and also strengthening the multi-generational connections. One of the things we've been working on is co-designing amongst a multi-generational group things like data trusts, in fact. So cooperative data trusts where you have control over what data you gather, how it's used, who is using it, and who has access to it. That both informs people about the risks and opportunities of data, but also one of the things we're finding is it helps for those individuals who are not represented within the data, individuals with disabilities, people who are very diverse from the average or the typical. And one of the beefs that frequently comes up is the infantilization of you as you age. So retaining that dignity, including the dignity of risk, being able to determine how much risk you want to take, determining how long you wish to self-determine what will happen to you, and preparing for inevitable deterioration of either health or cognition, but predetermining that in some way. So the recording of that, the planning for that, and engaging a supportive community in that is one of the things that we're finding many people wish to retain, and that I think we talked about companies and we talked about the government, but I think there is a third actor here, which is the cooperatives, the communities, where it's neither the government or there is some relationship with those, but there's a much more self-determination within a cooperative, especially when it is multi-generational and there are those social ties that continue. And just one last thing, we have a co-design toolkit that we've developed. So people that we're talking about designing with and by, and one of the things we're working on is how to democratize the creation of technologies that have greater longevity and sustain the design. So you have that automaticity and you can form habitual relationships with things so that as your cognition declines, you don't need to continuously relearn.
Thank you. And my apologies for mispronouncing your name. That must be my American education.
No, it's fine. And I accept any pronunciation.
You raised an interesting, we've not heard from, I'm just trying to see if any of our Singapore colleagues are there, because our last visit there, I was very impressed with the sort of multi-generational, but sort of smart design communities that are there. Are there learnings around data, privacy, right, all of this? And what would the next generation of that design around those from that would allow both greater supportive communities, but also allow, coming back to the public health, the ability to have learnings from at a community level from environments like that were designed both to help, but actually are learning environments. And if anybody wants to comment on that.
If I could comment, because there are several things related to that. First of all, if you're highly unique or a minority, then the privacy protections, whether it's the GDPR or others, don't work. So de-identification at source, differential privacy. With differential privacy, it removes the specifics that you need for the systems to serve you. And so what we've been exploring is bottom up. So beginning with on-device smarts, gathering your own data, and then aggregating it post just determining how to aggregate it, who to contribute it to. I think that also addresses the issue of the individualization of data and the personalization that others have talked about. I have much more to say to that, but I think there's others that probably want to chime in.
Thank you. I think Wendy was next, and appreciate your patience.
Thank you. I don't know where to begin because I have so many notes here of things I would like to talk about, but so I'll just pick one that's a little bit different than what folks have been talking about. One of the questions we were asked to think about is how to move forward, how to make advancements in this space. And, I look at many people on this Zoom, I already know, many people I do not. And that's one of the things that's exciting. We need to be bringing together these different communities. Clearly, everybody here has a lot of great thoughts about this topic. Some of the things people are saying, well, I'm not an aging researcher and I don't know about this. Well, some of us are aging researchers and we do know about that, and we should be talking to each other so that we're not reinventing the wheel. I mean, some of us, Sarah and Beth and Sheila and Marge, we've been in this space for more than 20, 30 years. We know quite a lot. We'd be happy to share it, right? And I think that's what we need to think about is how do we do that better? How do we bring together these pockets of research that are being done in different areas and different disciplines and link them with the healthcare providers, with the industry, with the people who are developing these things? I think that's what's going to help us to make more progress. And, events like this are great because we start to learn and meet more people, but then what do we do next? What's the next step to continue this activity and this conversation?
Very important, thank you. Sheila, I think, was next.
Thanks so much. I wholeheartedly agree with everything that Wendy just said. I think it's vital that the conversation not stop at the end of this workshop. I want to touch upon something else that's maybe at a little bit broader level, though, that a few people have alluded to this evening, at least here on the East Coast where I am. And it's about our society. You know, we are a digital society. We're an information-based society. As time continues to progress, it's harder and harder to access some things if you can't go online. And what I want to suggest is that we're not going to reach some of the larger scale that many of us have been talking about tonight unless we as a society start to value technology and technology access. And we see it as a basic right for everyone. So many people tonight have talked about, you know, you have to be able to reach the underserved populations. It's hard. You know, the poor people that live in economically depressed areas that don't have reliable transportation, that are lucky if they can get a cell signal. This is a major challenge for our society. And until the government, until society as an entity in and of itself values technology access, and broadband is an important part of that, I think we're going to be really challenged to see any of these things scale to really have significant impacts on successful aging, healthy aging, longevity in general.
Thank you. Marge?
Thank you all for all of your comments. It's been a great discussion. I want to bring up a couple of things that have been barriers for our research. And perhaps somebody on this great list has got some ideas on how to address them. Or maybe it's something we can work on together. So one of them is being able to really get the data. Like I agree with what was been said about, you know, it's a big data problem. We can use machine learning. We have great tools that are computational tools that can be used for this. We can collect lots of data from devices, from sensors. But if we want to do the rest of the piece and connect it to the health data, that especially if you want to do it on a larger scale and you want to do it in, say, private homes, that is a challenge. We've been able to do it on a smaller scale and we have a specialized home where I live in Missouri, which, you know, we have access to health record data there, and we can do studies there. But we've now moved into private homes, and we don't have finely grained health data to be able to make those connections easily. And so that's one challenge. There's also an issue of who owns the data. You know, if you ask the older adult participants who they think should own the data, they will say that they want to own the data. You know, it's their data. They should own it. They should control who has access to it. But trying to figure out how to do that logistically involves a lot of other people that can be a problem that I certainly would have a hard time addressing within my research group, for instance. So that's one issue. And yes, it has to be done ethically, as Judy had mentioned. I absolutely agree with that. So the other barrier that I have observed, and I'd love to get people's comments on this, has to do with all of the plethora of wearable devices that are out there. It's like, yes, we've got lots of devices, but older adults can't necessarily use them, at least not reliably, right? They can't remember how to charge them or remember how to put them on. Getting the data flows consistently is a problem. And so that brings us back to the issue that's been echoed here along from many people, is that we need to go back to the people themselves, the target users, and ask them, you know, what it is that would work for them. And I'm sure they will give us answers that will be different than what we expected. So those are just a couple of things. I know my other observation with our research participants is that they don't want to focus on their health very much. I mean, we put together this
I think pretty nice health app that runs on an Amazon Echo Show that gives you speech interface, via the voice platform as well as display via graphs and so forth. You've got a linguistic translation of the sensor data. I mean, it was co-designed with them iteratively. And you know what they want to use their Echo Shows for? They don't want to look at their sensor data. They want to play music. They want to look at the weather. They want to look at news, but they don't want to look at their sensor data. I mean, sometimes they do. Actually, we have a way of converting it to fall risk. And so, yeah, that's interesting. Now, the family members want to look at their sensor data, but the older adults are not necessarily so interested in looking at it. So that's another challenge. Anyway, I'll stop there. Maybe somebody's got some suggestions.
Thank you. Being an endocrinologist, one of the things one learns is often the patient doesn't want to know their blood sugar. It's not that they don't have the capability to measure it. And so I think, thank you for raising that, because sometimes we assume because it can be measured that the subject actually, or the individual or the person, wants that information. Tachi, I know you had your hand raised, so I'm also going to throw something at you. We've been talking about personalized therapies for a long time. We have all this technology. It's been raised again today. We've at best got to cohort specific, perhaps, interventions. Maybe you want to comment on that. I'm sure you have something else to raise there, but at some point we've got to say, what is it that's stopping us being able to get there? I think you're on mute, Tachi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I had the interesting experience of going from a private for-profit company to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And there we had many interventions that worked, but there was very little uptake. And what I learned was that in the public health arena, there's very little attention being paid to marketing. How do you create a market? How do you create a demand for an important solution? Instead, in public health, we tend to sort of push down solutions and say, take it, it's good for you. And fundamentally, I think this is a challenge, especially with the elderly, because often we assume that the elderly don't have a mind of their own, or that they're not vain, or that that they don't care what people think of them. I'm reminded of my father, who into his 80s could literally hear nothing, but he refused to wear a hearing aid. And the reason why is because he said, I don't want to look old. I don't. And yet, of course, hearing aids are one of the best interventions for the elderly. Not being able to hear creates not only a loss of important sensory input, a loss of communication, also creates paranoia. And yet this is a solution that is affordable, accessible, and people don't use it. So I think what we need to do is focus not just on accessibility, but also on creating an incentive to take up solutions, a reason for those solutions to be taken up beyond the fact that it's good for me.
Thank you. Anjo.
Okay, thank you for this opportunity, Chairman. I think I'm the biologist, so I don't work on the technology, but certainly technology is critical. Most of the aspect we discussed today is about more or less medio-social aspect, but I also wish to discuss a little bit about biological problem solution by technology. One example I know is there's a company called Cyberdyne in Japan. This machine is a sensor of the electronic signal from brain to muscle, and amplify this signal and stimulate the movement of the muscle. And this kind of robot, small scale robot, is already in market. And they actually did a large scale clinical trial and found if the patient take this instrument soon after, like brain hemorrhage or heart attack, the improvement enhanced a lot. So the technology certainly helps biological activity and supports longevity and the quality of life. So I would appreciate technology, certainly important for social problems, but even still, the medical problem can be solved by improvement of technology. Thank you.
Thank you for raising that. I'd like to go to Beth. We'll come back to that because I tried to get a discussion, stimulate at least a conversation around it. And rather than looking at there's the technology and all the connectivity and information, which we spend a lot of time on, but the ability for technology to inform our biology and ideally improve it. And maybe I'll come to, since Eric spoke about the biology, I'll come back to Eric in a minute on that. But at some point, we have to bridge that potentially. But Beth, let's have yourself, and then Eric, maybe I can come to you to share your thoughts of what the opportunity might be as this next frontier.
Thank you. Now, I wanted to mark what seems to be an interesting debate in our group going back and forth, both in the comments and in the chat, which is this notion of, are we designing for aging? Are we marketing as aging? What is kind of the gestalt of this? And, Sheila and others and Joe started this conversation. And I wanted to retell a story that back in 2001, I had a National Academies workshop. I was presenting to the FCC to describe why broadband was critically important to an aging population, and completely fell on the deafest ears that I have ever seen. The perception was broadband was just about entertainment. It was about a fat pipe of TV going down. I think they literally referred to Seinfeld, and a tiny itty bitty little pipe going up, because that was only going to be necessary for controlling that big content going down. We need to wrestle with and communicate as a community the importance of technologies for the aging portion of our lives. While I agree that technology can't be designed to be ugly or insulting, or to make one stick out from the perspective of being frail or impaired, as a society, we've agreed that that broadband and technology matters for education. There's been a huge conversation about K to 12. Certainly within the pandemic, we've agreed that the ability to work from home happens to matter a bunch, and technologies for the workplace. But there's still this deficit of understanding across that platform that Joe mentioned, across the agencies, that technologies as a whole are a pivotal piece of our approach as a society for the aging decades, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond. Now, whether we call it aging or elder or smart, I don't know, but I don't think we can just kind of cloak it under consumer electronics and hope that the right thing happens for older adults. We have way too much evidence, Marge and Wendy and Sarah, there's too many people that know that that's not going to work. So we need to speak with one voice around this. And then with that one voice, we go back to what Wendy was saying and communicate, all right, if technology is going to work for 60, 70, 80, 90-year-olds, here's what we have to do to get there. So I realize that it's great that we have a consumer revolution and that people don't like technologies that make them feel old or infirm. but we can't get away from the agenda around technology for aging itself. So
Beth,
end of soapbox.
Yeah. No, thank you, and it's clearly an important point. Before I come back, Eric, I do want to take the chance at the last few minutes, and then I'll come back to Dawn and Wendy. But we've had a session on biology. We've had a session on technology. We haven't taken the opportunity to say how one might enhance the other. So I'm going to put Eric on the spot. You're on mute, Eric.
Can I share a slide?
Sure.
Let me see. I don't know if actually one of the share screen. Let me just.
Anna, is that, there you are.
Is it working?
Yes.
Yeah, one area that really fascinates me and that we discussed in the previous session is the idea that from a biological standpoint, if we want to modify aging, and I think we are learning how to modify aging, we have to be able to measure it. And if you think about the tools that we use to measure aging in traditional medicine, essentially it's your blood pressure, your blood sugar, and so on. So this is the past. It's very limited. And so that means that preventative medicine is extremely limited in its current iteration. And this slide is showing you where we are today, where we have a proliferation of these novel functional tools, many of them actually driven by the technology revolution. I've listed a few of them, the ability of your telephone to count, to measure your number of steps per day, your movement, your gait speed, your VO2 max. For example, some of the Garmin watches actually have a pretty precise estimate of your maximum oxygen consumption. Your living space, which is defined as the amount of space that you actually occupy. Just imagine like a world traveler versus someone who is fixed into one room. There's a clear evidence that a contraction of your progressive contraction of your living space is a great indication of your lifespan. Balance monitoring. I was talking this morning to a company that has generated a sole that you can put in your feet that can actually predict Parkinson's disease 6 years in advance. Voice recognition, for detection of depression, sleep analysis, and so on. I think we are, then there's a whole set of new biomarkers of aging that I've listed before, which are purely biological. But the part that really excites me is what is going to come out of these functional tools. The pictures are shown on the left side, because I think once we're going to be able to link the data that's generated by those, along with some true biological markers, I think we have the potential of having each patient, each individual become a study on its own, where, by following some of these markers, we will be able to predict and you will be able to intervene. So I think the technology I'm convinced it is not there today, because there is a need for artificial intelligence to integrate these large amount of data sets. But I'm convinced that that's where the future is, not more medical tests, but the integration of these tools in our lives.
Thank you, Eric. No, this was, I appreciate that. I just want to remind our broader audience to email in any questions that they may have, as we have in our last 10 minutes or so. Please take that opportunity. Oh, we're saying happy birthday again. There we are. Don, back to you.
Yeah, just quickly following up on Professor Hanjo's comment. Out of our institute, there's a technology of wearable robotics, which are literally fabrics with Velcro that fit around, that are individualized for patients, that are being sold commercially now, FDA approved for stroke rehabilitation. But what they're finding is that with these type of wearable rehabilitation devices, you get input 7 days a week, rather than going for rehabilitation 1 day a week for 3 hours. It's totally different type of response. Another technology, picking up on what Eric said, are shoe insoles that not only measure or predict, but these actually give elderly the balance of 20-year-olds. using stochastic resonance. But you can imagine having carpet that does this in an old age home. And the idea of designing an environment where you don't have to sell it to the patient because they don't even know they're being treated. So I think there are amazing new technologies that are not just data collection, but therapeutics.
Thank you, Don. Wendy?
Just a quick comment that builds off of what other people have been talking about. We're talking about, technology to biology, but the big gap in the middle is human behavior. People have mentioned that a lot, right? We need to understand behavior change and how do we get people to do things? How do we get them to adopt these new technologies? How do we make sure we're providing the right facilitating conditions and instructional support and adoption and making clear the value and the usefulness and so on and so forth. It's the humans, the stubborn humans, that are in the middle, and we need to focus on the behavior part if we're going to influence biology, because we need to think about nutrition and physical activity and early detection and sleep quality, not smoking. All of those things are behaviors. And how can technology influence the behavior, which will in turn influence the biology?
Aging wouldn't be a problem if it wasn't for the humans. I think we could get around the problem. Sarah.
Yeah, I'd just like to build on what Wendy said and say that not only do we have to think about the behavioral aspects of the human, but also the emotional aspects of the human, because I think that's an important thing to think about when we're thinking about use of and adoption of these technologies. And it certainly has an influence on receptivity and behavior change. So I think we have to think about the whole person, from the biology, emotional, as well as behavioral.
Thank you. Are there any other comments or questions before I take the opportunity to start to wrap up?
Just a quick build from Wendy to Sarah, which is, I think I love the quote about the dignity of risk. We also have to talk about what happens at the end of aging and how that is negotiated. And so if we have behavior and we have emotions and we also have values, and too often the technological perspective around optimization for aging, is either perfectly healthy or perfectly safe. And no one wants either of those. So to have a realistic approach about how the design arc of these technologies, we have to recognize that different values and priorities and end games are part of those design, and understand what it means to build that as well.
Thank you, Beth.
I could just add one very brief comment, just to not leave it unsaid, that hearing aids are not affordable, and they may become more affordable, but right now they're still very, very expensive. And so, and there is the behavior change involved in whether someone chooses to wear a hearing aid, as we heard about recently, and that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I just didn't want to leave that unsaid, that there's a long way to go to bring down the cost of hearing aids.
So thank you. Before I wrap up, one other question, perhaps if I may, to Belinda. As we think about actually taking care, we've talked about communities, we've talked about accessibility, we've talked about behavior, but clinicians take care of patients one at a time. And a lot of professions are part of that clinical sort of ecosystem that we surround patients with. How do you see technology, where's the development of technology that actually taking care of an aged person and keeping them functional?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's a big challenge, not only for consumers being able to understand and identify technologies to use, but I think consumers look to clinicians to have the answers about what is a suitable technology, what's an appropriate app to monitor my health, how do I integrate this into my health plan, and we have probably a lot of work to do in building the digital literacy of our health professionals, so that we are capable of understanding what is available and being able to evaluate, the evidence base behind these fancy technologies that, are marketed to consumers, and be able to put them into practice in a meaningful way in order to support and enhance the care that we provide. So we've talked a lot about monitoring technologies, and we also have a lot of technologies that are available that can help to support recovery, to guide exercise, to pull data. But then what does the clinician do with it? How do they give meaning to it? It is an area that we really need to consolidate with the help of the key partners, consumers, clinicians, the industry, and working out how that fits, into the not fits into the current system, but how do we change the system to make this work for us? So technology is a disruptor, but sometimes there's some immovable, administrative and policy areas that we need to actually start to push the boundaries of.
Thank you. Well, this has been an amazing series of interactions, engagements from a very diverse group, which I think makes these sessions that much more powerful, given the background expertise and perspectives from everybody. I want to, before we, of course, close, thank all of the staff at the Academy who actually do all the work to make this possible. Zoom is the tool, but we haven't replaced the absolute necessity of the humans who actually do all the work to bring this and convene all of this. So I know I speak on behalf of everybody. Thank you very much, as well as, of course, to the leadership and leadership under Linda and Victor and Tachi. But Joanna in particular, I know you've been amazingly persistent and diligent. So hats off to yourself for doing this. Once again, Joe, thank you for taking the time on your birthday to speak to us, and I hope your birthdays sequentially are going backwards, not forwards. So if you figured that out mathematically, please send me an email how I might incorporate that.
I'm not just a researcher, I'm a subject of research.